The Soviet Union, a superpower that once made the whole world tremble, why did it suddenly collapse overnight? Although in the eyes of outsiders, the Soviet Union was indeed very strong, only they knew how serious its internal problems were. Since the day the Soviet Union was founded, it had been facing a very serious problem of food shortages. Although the Soviet Union's territory is large, most of it is frozen, hard land. It's difficult to grow food, but there are a lot of people, which means the Soviet Union was chronically short of food. Soviet leaders once engaged in a corn movement to solve the problem by planting corn, but except for a small number of places like Ukraine, most of the land couldn't even get the seeds to sprout. Later, the Soviet Union simply gave up on self-sufficiency and used its oil revenue to buy food. As a result, in the 1980s, when oil prices plummeted, even the money to buy food was gone. In addition, the Soviet Union spent most of its money on weapons. At its peak, the Soviet Union had 45,000 nuclear warheads in its stockpile, enough to blow up the Earth several times. On the other end, its civilian industry couldn't even make a TV or a washing machine on its own. All daily necessities relied on imports, and its exports were almost entirely oil and natural gas. As soon as the oil price collapsed, the Soviet national treasury fell sharply. By the time of the Brezhnev era, the problem of corruption became very serious. Basically, as long as you had money, you could be an official. Bribery for positions became a common rule. At that time, the Soviet Union's privileged class grew to 700,000 people. If you include their families, this group accounted for 1.5% of the country's population, yet they divided the wealth of the country among themselves as private property. In addition to this, there were growing nationalist emotions. The Soviet Union was divided into 15 republics, but Russia regarded itself as the big brother. Other ethnic groups believed they were being treated as second-class citizens, and they began to desire independence. The earliest were the Baltic states. Later, Ukrainians and others also began to bring up old accounts, such as the forced collection of food in the 1930s that starved millions of people to death. By the time the Gorbachev era arrived, the Union was not far from collapse. He initially wanted to achieve rapid economic growth through the priority development of machine manufacturing. However, this reform of the Soviet economy did not succeed and only worsened material shortages. Seeing that this was not working, he thought, "I don't understand the economy, why don't I rectify politics?" He directly canceled the leadership of the Communist Party, began to implement multi-party rule and a presidential system, and launched a public movement of glasnost, or openness. That is, to allow the media to criticize the history of the Soviet Union. This led to the exposure of a large number of Stalin's crimes. The moral authority of the Soviet Union was completely shattered. The stupidest thing he did was to take the initiative to fire 80,000 military commissars, letting the Communist Party completely lose control of the gun barrel. By the time of the August 19th coup attempt in 1991, when military officers rose up, he did not even have the ability to protect himself. In addition, the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in a military competition. It was fooled by the Star Wars plan, the Strategic Defense Initiative, into burning 8% of its GDP. When fighting in Afghanistan, they thought they could win quickly, but the war dragged on for 10 years with no result. A lot of money was burned, and the lives of young soldiers were lost in vain. When oil revenue plummeted, military expenses could not be covered, and they could only watch the empire fall apart. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet president announced in a national speech that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would cease to exist. A superpower disappeared without a sound. There was no foreign enemy. It was purely that he had lost himself.